Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Tacoma County Sports Museum's Locker Room Chat. Hello, and I'm Jay Strickers, your honored host for today's Locker Room Chat. And we are extremely excited to have as our guest today, Ed Bowman. Ed's a Tacoma athlete, broadcaster, referee, professional administrator at many, many levels. Ed, welcome to the Locker Room Chat.
Good morning, Jay. Thank you for having me with you this morning. I've been looking forward to it.
You bet. And we've been looking forward to spending some time with you and learning more about your life and your career and all the connections you've had here with Tacoma and Pierce County, Ed. So let's go ahead and start, as we always do, with the younger years. There's a lot to talk about, but it all starts with your youth growing up. I believe it certainly was in Tacoma. Your early involvement in sports and schooling and so forth.
Okay, that'll be fine. Uh, Actually, I grew up during the Depression, and my mother and father and my brother, who was 5 years older than I, lived with my grandparents because we could not afford to live anywhere else. And so that was a tough time during the Depression. And I always recall my mother reminding me that she had to save her pennies to find 25 cents to go to the movie theater.
Amazing. Ed, was that in Tacoma?
That was in Tacoma, yes, on 4533 South J Street, matter of fact. And I started my education in kindergarten in 1940. And in 1940, we were living in the Whitman grade school area. So I started my kindergarten at Whitman grade school. And as the year went on, my parents were finally able to find enough money to build a new house at 158 South 45th Street, which is just off of Pacific Avenue at South 45th. And they built a new house, a two-story house with an unfinished attic and bedrooms and bathroom downstairs. And they built the house for $2,000. That was in 1940. And so before the kindergarten year ended, we moved from J Street to South 45th, which meant that I had a walk of better than a mile and a half to walk from Whitman to our new home at 45th and Pacific. And people would stop because I was alone and walking home. People would stop and ask if I was lost or if I was okay. But I was fine, and I was fine. But that was the 1940 kindergarten. I was at Mary Lyon Grade School from 1941 to 1946. I was at Stewart Junior High School from 1947 to 1949. And at the end of my ninth grade year at Stewart, I was selected as the Boy of the Year at the end of the school year. And my friends, Bruce Olson and Erling Mork and some other folks, said that the only reason I won the award is that my mother was president of the PTA. That may have been true, I don't know. But anyway, we were at Stewart Junior High School until 49, and then was at Lincoln High School from 1950 to 1953. And at the end of the senior year at Lincoln, I was had an opportunity to look back at the yearbook, and the yearbook said that I was nominated and elected as the most likely to succeed. So perhaps that is true from 1953 up until today.
Well, Ed, if we're interviewing you for the locker room chat, there had to be a lot of successes along the way, that's for sure. So, look at how about your involvement in sports in those early years? What was your connection? Was it through school, through clubs? Any teams, coaches you can think of that were memorable to you in your growing up years prior to going to CPS?
Well, back in my early days, at age 11 or 12, I played Little League baseball, and my father was the manager of the team. We played for the Harmon Bearcats, and I have a lot of good memories from a lot of longtime friends many, many, many years ago that played along with me. I was a pitcher and a first baseman, and that was back when I was 11 or 12 years old. At Stewart Junior High School, I turned out for the junior high school basketball team, and I was cut. I was cut because I was 5'6", weighed 162 pounds, and was not really basketball playing material. But I then decided that I'd become the manager of the team. So as a ninth grader, I was manager of the Stewart Junior High School basketball team. And then the next year, as we got to Lincoln, I had grown over the summer from 5'6" to 6'1", 7 inches over the summer. In fact, my mother had already purchased my pants earlier in the summer, and I outgrew them before I ever wore them. But nevertheless, uh, there I was turning out for Lincoln High School as a sophomore, and I made the team. And the next year, Chuck Gilmer became the coach at Lincoln High School, and I played my junior and senior years at Lincoln under Chuck Gilmer. Chuck Gilmer had come to Lincoln from the NBA, where he had played for the Washington Capitals. And as high school kids do, I bought some bubblegum cards during those years, and the bubblegum cards told me Charles Gilmer, bad boy of basketball. And he was called the bad boy of basketball because even playing in the NBA, he was the center for the Washington Capitals, and he was uh, only 6'4", so he had to commit a lot of fouls, and that's why he was the bad boy of basketball. But we had a lot of chuckles over that throughout the years.
You had some chuckles with Coach Gilmer.
With Chuck Gilmer, right, right.
That's a good statement because you and I certainly remember him in his officiating days and his officiating careers, and a wonderful historian with rules knowledge, etc. But a man with a few words at times, but you
Yes.
certainly listened to him when he said something.
Well, it was very interesting. It seemed like Chuck Gilmer didn't have too many friends, but after I graduated from Lincoln and went back to teach at Lincoln, I became very good friends with him, and we did a lot of things together, and I count my blessings for knowing Chuck Gilmer.
Amen. Couldn't agree with you more on that. So Lincoln High School, tell us a little bit about the teams, the leagues you played in then. Certainly that would have been the old gym at Lincoln with the track around up on top.
That
Uh,
is correct. Well, it was interesting that Lincoln played in the City League, and the City League was made up of only Lincoln, Stadium, and Bellarmine,
yeah,
just three teams. But Lincoln also played in the Cross State League, and the Cross State League was Lincoln, Stadium, Seattle Prep, Everett, Bellingham, and Bremerton. In fact, Everett and Bellingham, we would play a weekend series. They would come to Tacoma for a weekend, Friday, Saturday, and we would go to Bellingham to play a Friday and Saturday. And they had uh, a 6'9" center at Bellingham. His name was Elmer Gurner, I believe it was. And we did not win the league title, but we played very well.
there you go. So wonderful memory. So it sounds like basketball became your sport over baseball and other sports. Tell us about moving on to CPS and how you matriculated there for academics as well as for your athletic career.
Well, it's very interesting. I was not planning to go to CPS. I was planning to go to Washington State College with my friend Bruce Olson, whom I mentioned earlier. Bruce and I started in kindergarten together, and we were going right on through our school years. But on the night of graduation at Lincoln in 1953, I went to the graduation parties and so on and so forth and got home. And I was working at Safeway at the time. In fact, I started working at Safeway when I was 13 years old back in 1948. And I had a 7 o'clock job to get to Saturday morning, the day after graduation. I got out of bed and my legs wouldn't hold me up, and down I went, and I couldn't get up. And it turned out that I had rheumatic fever,
Ooh,
and that was not a very good thing. So I had rheumatic fever. I certainly couldn't go to work at Safeway. And as it turned out, I was in bed most of the summer, but got got the clearance from the cardiologist in late August to play basketball, and but please stay close to home. Don't go to Pullman. So there went my idea of playing for Washington State. But I went to I called Coach John Heinrich at CPS, and he gave me a scholarship to play for him. Now, a scholarship, remember, this is 1953. In 1953, it meant that we paid $212 a semester for tuition, which my parents still had a hard time paying. In fact, I did not live at the Kappa Sigma fraternity house where I pledged. I had to live at home and travel each day between South 45th and Pacific Avenue and CPS. But it all worked out very well.
It's amazing. If I remember right, in that era, Coach Heinrich would have coached football, basketball, numerous sports.
He
What can you
coached
tell
every
us?
Yeah, he coached everything, and of course, he taught many classes too. In fact, he had Tom Cross, whom we all know. Tom Cross was teaching classes at CPS as well.
Sure. So, my records indicate you were a four-year letterman, team captain. What can you tell us about your CPS playing career and any insights into Coach Heinrich? And, we all know he became such a great historian here in Tacoma and a sports figure. So, any recollection of people, teammates from that era, Ed, that would be good for us to hear about and recollect.
Well, I was very fortunate to play for Coach Heinrich at CPS. In fact, my four-year letterman blanket is behind me on this picture today. And I was very fortunate to play 4 years of basketball, especially after being ill that summer. And we had pretty mediocre teams, but that's okay. We played well, and I remember that in one trip in my senior year, Doug MacArthur and Dick Velo, the engineer for KTAC Radio, the two of them told me if I scored 30 points in a game, they would buy me a case of beer. Well, as a college student, of course, that sounded exciting to me. And we were on a weekend trip playing Lewis and Clark in Portland on a Friday night and University of Pacific University on Saturday night. But Coach Heinrich wasn't there. He was in San Francisco receiving an award of some type. And so Coach Joe Hemmel, our assistant coach, was there with me and with the team. And we were beating Lewis and Clark handily. In fact, with 6 minutes to go in the game, I had 29 points. And with 5 minutes to go, Coach Hemmel took me out of the game. And I couldn't very well tell the coach I had to play for one more shot and one more point in order to win a case of beer. So I only ended up with 29 points. And as it turned out, I was not even high point man. I played with Tom Names and Don Moside, and Tom Names scored 30 points that night, and I had 29. So I wasn't even high point man on the night that I thought I was going to win my award.
Oh, that's a great story. We all talk so much about NIL deals now. It sounds like maybe you had a potential NIL contract back in the day.
Not really.
No. So, Ed, you talked about high school, the teams you played. CPS, you mentioned a couple schools that are D1 schools now. Who the league for CPS then, and the teams that you would have played?
We played in one league that had CPS, PLC, of course, Whitworth, and Eastern Washington, and Central Washington. And Dean Nicholson was the basketball coach at Central at that time. And we held our own. We did not win the title, but we played well, and we had a lot of fun.
Yeah. Which gym would you have been in then at
It was
that
the
point?
old CPS field house.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Which I believe is still on campus and still
The field
utilized.
house is there. It's been completely renovated,
Yeah,
and it's now a completely different structure. Right.
you bet. Well, wonderful recollection there, certainly. So now you're a college graduate. It's time to move on in life to figure out what you're going to do professionally. Broadcasting certainly comes into your purview in your life. Tell us a little bit about how that came about, your introduction to broadcasting, how, who, and when, etc.
Well, broadcasting was an avocation. I was an educator and a high school sophomore basketball coach, which was my main thrust.
Yeah.
Uh, but it was very interesting that I was able to do the things that I did with broadcasting, and way that started back in the late 1940s. Doug MacArthur, his parents lived just a block and a half up the hill from where my family lived. And he lived next door to one of my grade school classmates, Tom Westman. I went to visit Tom one day, and I happened to meet Doug for the very first time. Like I say, he had just returned from his military service and had not yet started at KTAC radio. But I met Doug and we were talking about sports, and he said he asked me if I would be interested in being a spotter for the football games when they broadcast on the radio. And I said, spotter, what is a spotter? And he said, a spotter, you fill out the charts before the games with the names and heights and weights and year of school and so on for all the players on the team. And then as the play goes on, with a pencil, you point to the uh, different people who have made the tackle in the game or have scored the touchdown, who have done this or that. And I said, gee, that sounds interesting. Why don't we give it a try? So I started back in the late 1940s as a spotter on radio games broadcast by Clay Huntington and by Doug MacArthur. And as the years went by, I became the statistician. And then after I became the statistician, I started giving the statistics at halftime and final game scores, and things were going along quite well. Well, let's see, have to think of the year. In 1988, 1955, sorry, I broadcast from 1955 to 1980, 25 years. And in 1955, I was, let me get a clear thought here of 1955. Clay Huntington asked me if I would be interested in doing a play-by-play broadcast at the Washington State High School Class B basketball tournament at the College of Puget Sound Fieldhouse.
Yep.
And I was amazed and thrilled and said, yes, I'd be very happy to do a broadcast. Well, I did more than one broadcast because the broadcast team was Clay Huntington, Doug MacArthur, Bob Robertson, Don Hill, and me. And so that was a pretty good group of people to start with. Back in 1955, the beginning of my 25-year avocation as a sportscaster. And it just went on from there. In that Class B tournament, Wenatchee and Bellingham had two radio stations in each city, and they had many small towns around their radio stations that were in the tournament. And so whenever it came to Bellingham or Wenatchee broadcast, two of us would do the same game, and one of us would be on one station and one of us would be on the other station in that particular city.
Yeah. Now, Ed, we all remember those old tournaments at CPS and UPS, the Class B when it was only A and B, and of course the Class A when the state went to double A. Phenomenal tournaments, a lot of fun for everybody. But going from being a spotter to being the person behind the mic, two different skill sets. Did you have some practice with that? You just learned from the great names you mentioned, but what helped you make that transition to where you could get behind the mic and speak and talk and relate the game to the people that are on the other end of the radio waves?
Well, very interesting you asked that question. When we lived on South 45th Street, we lived on an alley and we had a brick fireplace on the house. And I would go in the alley with a tennis ball and my glove, and I would throw the tennis ball against the brick fireplace. And finally, I decided, well, why don't I take some lineups out of the paper and bring the lineups out to the alley and do a broadcast. So we started broadcasting games in the alley, throwing the ball against the fireplace. My neighbors thought that I had gone loco and gone nuts, but nevertheless, that's how I basically started my interest. And when I taught school, I taught high achievement English, so I had some skills as far as knowing the English language.
That's wonderful. You talk about broadcasting being an avocation. Let's talk a little bit about your teaching career then, and et cetera. I think you are recollected that you returned to Lincoln High School to teach it. Coach there, tell us a little bit about your teaching days, and then even how that moved on to your career at, I guess, eventually UPS.
Well, it was interesting. Let's digress and go back to high school. When I was in high school at Lincoln, I was elected as a student court judge. Can you believe that? They had a student court judge in high school. And there was a new teacher who had just come to town, who was 22 years old, who was named as the advisor for the student court judge. And his name was Dick Hanula. Now, you know Dick Hanula from all of his swimming exploits and his worldwide renown. Dick was 22 years old, and he became the advisor for the student court judge. And Dick was a very interesting man. When he came that summer before he started at Lincoln, he had just graduated from Washington State College. So he went to Lincoln for an interview, and they were interviewing for the basketball job and the swimming job. And they were talking to him in terms of basketball, basketball, basketball. And finally, Dick stopped them and said, wait a minute, I would much prefer to coach swimming. And so that's how that happened. He became, at 22 years old, the swimming coach at Lincoln High School, followed by being the swimming coach at Wilson High School. And he won, 32 straight state swimming championships, became renowned for coaching swimmers who swam in the Olympics and the Pan American Games. In fact, was one of the head coaches on the Pan American Games swimming team.
He certainly had a great career, that is for sure. So you taught at Lincoln. Did you do some coaching then before you matriculated on to a UPS? What's the time frame for all of that interaction?
I taught high school from 1957 to 1970. And from 1957 into the 60s, I taught high achieving English at Lincoln High School.
Yeah.
And I coached sophomore basketball
Yeah.
and worked along with Chuck Gilmer. In fact, also was the head timer at the bench for Lincoln's home games. So was very much involved in what was happening around Lincoln sports-wise. Then transferred to Wilson High School and coached sophomore basketball at Wilson High School, and Dan Enveen was our coach.
Sure.
And Dan Enveen was not only a wonderful coach, but he was also a teammate later on when we both played for the Cheney Studs.
How do you end up going on and working at UPS?
That's a very interesting story also. I've been blessed by so many wonderful things and achievements that have happened. On one Saturday morning, I had a phone call from Richard Dale Smith, and Dick Smith had been my advisor when I attended CPS, and he asked me if I would come and see him on Monday morning. No, he didn't say Monday morning. He says, "Can you come see me?" And I said, "I can come Monday after school." He says, "Why can't you come right now?" And I went to his backyard at a house overlooking the water by Day Island. And we started talking about CPS. And he said that the director of admissions at CPS was going to be leaving, and he was looking for a new director of admissions. And I said, "Director of admissions? That's a far reach from my Lincoln High School English teaching days." And he said, "Yes, it is." And I says, "Let me go home and may I go home and talk to my wife and see what she thinks about the idea? And he said yes. Excuse me. So we decided, Kath and I decided on the spot that that would be a nice advancement to my career. And so in September, I went to September of 1970. I went to UPS as the director of admissions. And 3 years later, I was named dean of admissions by R. Franklin Thompson, who was the president of the university, and Richard Dale Smith, who was the vice president of CPS, or was UPS then. So there we go.
Well, that's amazing. Obviously, this person's out something in you that maybe you didn't even know that you had in your repertoire of expertise in leadership. I
Well,
think I was,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
One of the first things that I had to do was to make out a schedule for our admission staff to go visit high schools throughout Washington and Oregon and in California to recruit new freshmen. And it was there that there was an interesting story came about. One of my trips was scheduled for the Los Angeles area, and so I was down there, and I went into Westlake School for Girls in Westlake near UCLA, and I met a young lady by the name of Greta. And Greta, her classmates called her Gigi. Well, Gigi was very interesting. We had the 1 hour session that morning that I was there, and I told them that I'd be back at the end of the month for an evening session so we could talk with the parents. And she came up to me afterward and said, Mr. Bowman, I'm so much looking forward to that. I want you to meet my father at that session when you come back. So a month later, I went back and I went into Westlake School for Girls. And Gigi came up to me and she says, Mr. Bowman, I'd like to have you meet my father, James Garner. James Garner, Maverick on TV. Excuse me. So we got to know James Garner fairly well. Well, as it turned out, Gigi came to UPS as a freshman. And for Parents Weekend football game in September, James Garner also came to UPS, and he was there for the football game. And so at UPS, there's an open broadcast booth where you're right out in the crowd. And I looked down 2 rows in front of me, and there's James Garner sitting all by himself. And so I made contact with him, and he gave me would you like for me to come up with you? And I said, absolutely, please do. So he came up, and my color commentator and statistician and broadcast partner during that game was James Garner. And we had a lot of fun, and it was a very interesting game. And we talked about him attending University of Oklahoma, how at University of Oklahoma he played football, but tore his knee out, which ended his sports career, and da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, I didn't think much of it after the broadcast was over and he went away. And I thought that's probably the last time I'll ever see James Garner. Well, at the University of Puget Sound, I was on a business trip with, no, it wasn't the University of Puget Sound. When I was with Matson Navigation Company in San Francisco, and we'll talk about that later, I met the president of our company, of Matson Agencies, and I went on a business trip and we flew into LAX. And flying into LAX, we then stopped at the United Airlines Red Carpet Club to use the restroom. And I came out of the restroom, and lo and behold, who do I see sitting there by himself reading a book but James Garner? And James Garner, the weekend before, had played in the Pro-Am golf tournament at Pebble Beach. And Gene Swanson, the Matson Agency's president, also was at the golf tournament with his wife. And in fact, they followed James Garner around the whole course during the round that he played, and he could not believe that he was meeting James Garner.
Well, we all remember James Garner, and as you said, Brett Maverick. And What a wonderful personality and
Oh,
engaging
perfect.
he was in that era and all through his career. Such a grounded, wonderful, easy spoken guy, just kind of drew you into like he was a close friend without even knowing him.
That's correct. That's
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
Well,
So
UPS was very very kind to me in the years that I was there, and becoming director of admissions and then dean of admissions was even more of a presence, and I really enjoyed it.
you bet. Wonderful. You talked avocations, playing basketball. You mentioned the Cheney Studs. Tell us a little bit about that level of competition, people that you played with in the games, the opponents, etc., Ed.
Well, after my graduation from CPS, Tom Cross got a hold of me, and Tom Cross was coaching the Cheney Studs. And he asked me if I'd be interested in playing for the Studs. And I said, yes, I would. And so I decided I would play with the Cheney Studs, and we would play various benefit games around with different teams and so on. But we played a lot of games against Fort Lewis. And Fort Lewis had a very good team. They had Boyd Dowler and Ray Nitschke, former players for Green Bay, and Tony Kubek, who had played for the New York Yankees.
Right.
So they were all playing for Fort Lewis, and we had a lot of very good games playing with them. Well, we had a pretty good team too. And on the important games, like a game at Fort Lewis, Johnny and Eddie O'Brien from Seattle University, Johnny's an All-American, they both decided with Tom Cross's coaching that they would come and play with the Cheney Studs. So we had Johnny and Eddie O'Brien, and they both, of course, later went on to play for the Pittsburgh Pirates in Major League Baseball. And we had occasionally we would have Bob Hubriggs from the University of Washington, Dick Cipriano from the University of Washington, and we had those of us from the local area who had played many years, including Eddie Pepples, who was an outstanding coach at Mercer Island High School.
What a wonderful era of semi-pro basketball in that time frame that we don't have anymore. But I remember those games quite often were on TV, Buchanan Bakers, etc.
Right.
Great athletes and a great level of basketball.
Yeah. Well, of course, we were a semi-pro team, but Johnny, whenever we had a paid crowd, Johnny O'Brien would always receive his $250. And the rest of us would split the rest of the gate. Sometimes it was $3, $5, $7. And by the time you stopped at the Cloverleaf for a beer and a pizza, you made nothing.
Oh, for the love of the game. Now, you played basketball, you coached basketball, you played semi-pro. Refereeing enters your repertoire of sports activities. Tell us about how you got involved in changing from being a player to being a referee and some of your memories from that era.
Well, again, Tom Cross, who coached us at the Cheney Studs, was the head of all the officials and made the scheduling of all officials during the year. And one day he called me and he said, "Do you have a whistle?" And I said, "Yes, I have a whistle." And he says, "I am working a junior high school basketball game at Mason Tuesday at 3 o'clock. I would like for you to come join me and be my partner on the court for that day." And and so I said, I don't have a shirt." He says, "I'll bring you a shirt." And so I worked that junior high school game with him, and that it just evolved from there. And I officiated from 1955 to 1980, which was the same time that I was broadcasting. So I had a lot of nights that I was not home because I was either broadcasting or officiating. And I just loved officiating. And I had officiated with a lot of wonderful partners. Uh, uh, Bruce Alexander, who later went on to uh, be in the NBA. Marty Erdahl, who was my neighbor, 2 doors away. And so Marty and I worked a lot of games together. And there were so many wonderful Jack Johnson and Dale Bloom and a lot of the lead officials and Lorne Merkel. And I was one night I went to the CPS Fieldhouse later on in years. I went to the CPS Fieldhouse to do a radio broadcast, and I was caught in the locker room by Tom Cross saying, "So and so, I forgot who it is, Ron Storsley. Ron Storsley
Sure.
is ill and can't work the game. Can you work the game with me?" And I said, "Yes." And as it turned out, I was living at a house just 3 blocks from the field house. So I quickly ran home, got my gear, came back, and worked the game at the field house with Tom Cross. And so that's kind of how my officiating career began. And it kind of evolved into more important games and so on. We made many trips down to Aberdeen and Hoquiam and play. They in Aberdeen, Hoquiam people were always so pleased when officials from Tacoma went down there. And you know officiating.
I sure do, Ed. I very much remember going down to Hoquiam with you once to officiate a football in the middle of, excuse me, basketball in the middle of the winter, and it was a wonderful experience for me. I can tell you that because you were very much in the mentor role. Realized I was a young official and got very fond memories of the drive down, the drive home, and especially the game there for sure. You mentioned such wonderful officials from that era in Tacoma, and we certainly had a great repertoire of basketball, football officials, people that would matriculate up into other levels, but a great era of officiating for sure. Ed, so you're at UPS. Somehow something else comes into the possibilities for you, and that's to relocate down to the Bay Area and take on another profession. Tell us how this all came about.
Well, that came about initially as not a very good remembrance. But what happened in 1976, I had broadcast the University of Puget Sound's NC2A Division II National Basketball Championship games from Evansville, Indiana. Doug MacArthur and I did the broadcasts. And the first night we defeated Old Dominion University, a Division I school. And for the championship, we defeated the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, 83-74. And I came back from working that delightful national championship game and found out that UPS was making some changes and that R. Franklin Thompson, the president, was going to retire. And I thought, well, gee, Richard Dale Smith will be the next president. That's good. Well, Richard Dale Smith was not the next president. Excuse me. So I decided that that was the time. Well, I did not decide. The new president decided that maybe I should sever my relationship with the University of Puget Sound. So I did. And it turned out that I found a job within a couple of weeks as a headhunter. A headhunter, you know, goes out and finds jobs for different people in different industries all around the country. Well, in being a headhunter, I found 2 job opportunities for myself here in this area, one of which is with the Kirk Company in Puyallup. And the Kirk Company is a family-owned company that was into Christmas trees and dried flowers. Well, it was very interesting that I then interviewed for the job, and I was supposed to be the general sales manager of the Kirk Company. And Papa Kirk Sr. Had Hawaii as his territory for selling Christmas trees to all of the big box stores and Safeways and the different grocery stores. And so I was hired And when I showed up for work the first day, they said, we're going to make a change. And I just arrived. And they said that their national product manager had passed away over the weekend, which was very sad news. So all of a sudden, instead of being the general sales manager for the Christmas tree division, I was national product manager. Okay, what does that mean? For a school teacher to become a position like this, a national product manager responsible for 90,000 acres of Christmas tree lands in Washington, Oregon, Montana, Wisconsin, and British Columbia. Well, not only that, but I was responsible for gathering cones, extracting seed, transplanting in nurseries, transportation, the whole gamut of things. So talk about on-the-job training. I had very quick on-the-job training. Well, it came Christmas tree season and time to ship trees. And Matson Navigation Company was the container ship between the West Coast and Hawaii. Matson did not have any refrigerated containers to give to us. That was not good news because you need to keep those trees quiet and dry and somewhat moist on the trip over to Hawaii. So all of a sudden, I was on the phone 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times a day with Mike Wasak, who was the president of Matson Navigation Company. Well, we got through the season. The trees arrived. We had an okay season without a glitch, without one glitch that came up when we decided to ship a load of trees on a flat rack with rope and 2x4s and fresh water and ship them over to Hawaii to see how the trees would be when they got there. Well, they turned out in fairly good shape, surprisingly. So we were very happy. But the people at the port in Honolulu decided not to throw those trees away. They decided to leave them out on the dock. Well, the Honolulu Advertiser newspaper came up with their photographer, took pictures of these decaying trees and had a headline in their Honolulu Advertiser newspaper, "This is what your Christmas trees will look like this year," which was not good news. So again, Mike Wasak got to me and da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, things went well and we got through the season. And in January, I had a phone call and it was Mike Wasak. And he said, we have an opening for general sales manager in San Francisco at our headquarters. And you would be the general sales manager for Matson's West Coast of Hawaii business. Would you be interested? I said, yes, I would. He said, well, our vice president, Brad Mulholland, who was a former quarterback at UCLA, Brad Mulholland is coming to Seattle office tomorrow, and he would like to interview you in a hotel downtown Seattle. And I said, that'll be fine. I'll be there. What time? And so on. I made those arrangements. And so the interview I thought, went very, very well. And the next day I had a call from Mike Wasak. He said, we'd like to offer you the position of general sales manager. Well, that meant no more broadcasting, no more officiating. Our daughters were 7 and 9 years old at the time, in grade school, means new school in California. And so I went home, we talked to Kathy, and the salary was commensurate with the position, so it was good.
Yep.
And we decided we would take the position. And so in September of 1980, I went to San Francisco, lived in an apartment in Walnut Creek by myself because the girls wanted to finish the school term in Fircrest along with Kathy. And Kathy had to sell the house in Fircrest and so on and so forth. So it was kind of a long way to go, but we worked it out very well. And Kathy came down in 1981. And while I'm talking about Kathy is my wife. There's a story in that as well. Kathy's from Buffalo, New York. On the day after Christmas in 1968, Kathy flew from Buffalo to Tacoma to join 2 of her girlfriends who were already there working in the area, one of whom was an officer in the Army who worked at Madigan General Hospital as a nurse. Kathy is a nurse. And so she flew in the day after Christmas to be with her two girlfriends and help pay the expenses. On New Year's Day of 1969, I was living with Bill Funk at the time in an apartment, and we were on the second floor of an apartment house on Highland Avenue. Kathy and her two girlfriends lived on the first floor directly below where we were. So the good Lord was really watching over me.
Amen.
That was in 1969, 56 years ago, and we will celebrate our 56th wedding anniversary coming up this next July. But anyway, on New Year's Day, there were about 15 guys that came over to watch New Year's Day football and football. And it was an interesting day. Of the 15 guys, 3 were priests that worked at Bellarmine, Father Bixel, and the president at Bellarmine, Father Dan Weber. But anyway, we were making quite a bit of noise and so on, and the phone rang, and it was the girls downstairs. And they said, the sparklies they had popcorn ceilings, remember? The sparklies are falling off the ceiling, and you're too noisy. Why don't you come up and join us? So I met Kathy at the door. And of course, all the men stood up, and they were all 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", basketball officials, football officials, and so on. And so she was reluctant to come in, but they did come in. And I said, what can I get you to drink? And Kathy says, I'll never forget this in all my life. She said, I will have a beer if I can open it myself. That didn't say too much for me, but nevertheless, so that's how that worked out. And then later on, and that's how I met Kathy. And in January, I was playing with the Cheney Studs on a January night, and I stepped on someone's foot and broke my ankle. And so being a nurse at TG, Kathy was able to nurse me back to health. And 56 years later, she's still nursing me.
Well, Ed, you mentioned the good Lord taking care of you. You certainly have had
Hey, Jay.
transitions in your life.
Hey, Jay,
Yes.
why don't you give him a chance to take a breath and maybe take a sip of water and stuff before you keep going?
Yeah, why not? Maybe I'll do the same, huh? Okay, ready?
Okay.
Anyway, Ed, you referenced the good Lord and giving you some blessings in your life. You certainly have had some significant transitions. You think about going from teaching to UPS as a dean of students there or admissions.
Admissions,
Then
yes.
you go from that into a professional career that's so unlike UPS, and then of course, meeting your bride Kathy there. Wonderful experiences. I'd
Well,
like to.
there's even more as far as the career goes because Matson Navigation Company was just the beginning of me being in my maritime career. Uh, in 1990, Matson Agencies decided Matson Agencies was the international arm of Matson, and so we dealt with water carriers from ships all over the world. And Matson decided to divest themselves of the agency organization. And so I then took a position for a short time as general sales manager at the Port of Olympia. And from that grew a position with Pacico Corporation. Pacico Corporation is the Mitsui company in Japan, and Pacico manufactures container handle gantry cranes, the huge cranes in the ports, gantry cranes in ports all over the world.
Yep.
So all of a sudden, I was responsible for all of those things that were going on. And I started by going to Spain and Italy, and Kathy was able to go with me. I put on an international conference in Santa Margherita Ligure, Italy, for Pacifico. And we said, gee, the men are in the meetings all day. What are we going to do with the women? Well, one day had a trip for them going to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And the next day, we had a trip for them going to Monaco. So the ladies were well taken care of and really enjoyed that. So Spain and Italy, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, uh, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, all of these places. And so I was traveling quite a bit. And so I thought there was a lot of travel with UPS, but this became even more travel. And I ended up with nearly 1 million miles on airplanes going all around the world. And the good part about the travel was that it was business class, and so it was very comfortable.
So, Ed, could you ever have imagined this from a kindergartner at Whitman Elementary School to these
Absolutely.
kinds of world travels that these things would have entered your life?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. I was
Well,
very fortunate.
obviously, each step along the way, there was somebody it was in that position that you were matriculating towards that had a sense of this is a guy that can step in and do this job and do it very well and help our organization, our company do well also. I want to
Well,
ask you one more. Go ahead. Go
so
ahead.
I was just going to say that when Matson divested themselves of the agency organization, I was 1 month short of 10 years in the Matson organization, and 10 years would have meant a lifetime pension. Well, I went to Mike Wasak and I said, what can we do to get me that last month in order to get me the 10 years? And he says, it's done. And so the first of every month, I thank Mike Wasak for the check that comes uh,
That's
for me in retirement.
That's wonderful. So I've got one question to ask you. I want you to relate to us a little bit, and then we'll just talk a little bit about family and the importance of that in your life, et cetera. And you reference your girls, but you were at UPS before the green and gold days. We know there were the green and gold days. You reference 1976 NCAA Division II national championships, playing numerous D1 schools. At that time, if I remember right, baseball was a Division I sport, and the change that came about just when you left. Any thoughts on that era? We know it's a highly emotional kind of component for people from Tacoma, particularly CPS, UPS people, but your thoughts, anything you'd like to relate about that era and how things transpired?
Well, I always felt very fortunate and very, very lucky. And in fact, I still run into people who were classmates, former classmates at CPS and so on. In fact, when we moved to where we are now in Gig Harbor, I live in a condominium complex, and they have a happy hour once a month during the summer. And one day we were at the happy hour, and I walked up and I saw this lady I had never seen before, I thought. And I said, my name's Ed Bowman. And she said, I know who you are. And I said, you do? So I said, why is that? She says, because you played basketball with my husband at CPS, John Marvin. And I said, oh my gosh, John Marvin, one of my super, super teammates. And she remembered me from when we were students, and I had not remembered her. But now we're both in our 90s and have a lot of good memories going back to those days.
You bet. Ed, why don't you talk to us a little bit about family? And you mentioned growing up with your folks in the Depression era through the 50s. Kathy, I think you said you had two daughters. Talk to us a little bit about family.
Okay, well, family is very, very important to me. I made one mistake along the way and it ended up in divorce, but it ended up with a plus two because my son is now going to be 61 years old in October. And so that's a real plus from that.
Yep.
But more importantly, Kathy was a cradle Catholic. And Kathy came to Tacoma, as I mentioned, on New Year's Day of 1969 is when I met her. And we were engaged in March of May of 1969 and married in July of 1969. And because I had been divorced, I was not able to be married in the Catholic Church, even though we had sent a letter to Rome and asked for dispensation.
Yeah.
That did not happen. But it all worked out okay. We were married in the chapel at a church in Tacoma, and it was only Kathy and me and her one roommate and my mother and my brother and Kathy's youngest brother and Kathy's parents. And so that was on the 31st of July, and all of the pre-arrangement stuff all said August 2nd. Well, we had to decide what we're going to do with that because we had champagne glasses and things that said August 2nd, and we were married on July 31st. Well, we got married on the 31st. The next morning, got on the airplane, flew to Buffalo, and on August 2nd, we had a reception for 250 people in the Buffalo area. And Kathy's uncle let us borrow his car, and we drove to our honeymoon site, which was, where else would it be? Niagara Falls, Canada.
Sure.
And so we had our honeymoon in Niagara Falls, Canada. But Kathy has been just so helpful to me, especially here in these later years when my health is deteriorating a little bit. But she has always been with me, and 56 years, 56 wonderful, wonderful years. Christy was born in 1971. Marissa was born in 1973. They were troopers too when moving from schools and moving from Tacoma to Danville, California, and being in the school. In fact, Marissa is teaching school in Danville, California, at the same grade school where she attended when we moved down there. So things always work out for the long run. But I'm so blessed to have such a wonderful family around me, and it's just great.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like Kathy's response to that, I'll have a can of beer only if I can open it myself, it's paid off pretty well for you.
Yes, it did, and for her as well.
Yeah. And anything worth chatting about here that I haven't brought up that you think would be important for our people here in Tacoma, Pierce County, and across our country to hear about you and your life experiences?
Well, we're so fortunate to live in the Tacoma Gig Harbor area, and we have just been so delighted. Oh, I have to tell you one little story. On April 17th, my birthday, in 1955, Leonard Mankey, who later became the owner of the Cloverleaf, and two of my other fraternity brothers took me to the Cloverleaf for my 20th birthday. Probably not all legal, but anyway, I was there for my 20th birthday. So this past April, we were there went in for a pizza, and I have been a customer at the Cloverleaf for 70 years. So that's a long time to be a customer in the same place. Oh, one thing I did not mention, 1969 was not only a wonderful year for our being married to Kathy, but I was working for a couple of years with the Tacoma Cubs baseball club in the Pacific Coast League. And that happened to be very, very interesting too. After school, after teaching school at Wilson, I would go over to the ballpark, especially on game days, and be there for to do the public relations work for the ball club. And also, I was the public address announcer for all of the home baseball games. But the Tacoma Cubs won the Pacific Coast League Championship in 1969. And the Cubs, now known as the Rainiers, I worked the championship series with Don Hill, and we broadcast the 5-game series, Tacoma and Eugene, the last 2 games being in Eugene. And the Cubs were able to win the last 2 games of the 5-game series and win the Pacific Coast League Championship for 1969.
Well, Ed, just thanks so much for chatting with us today, and thank you especially for all the thrills that you've brought to us during your playing, your broadcasting, refereeing, and your commitment to all things sports here within Tacoma and Pierce County. That concludes today's presentation, and we thank you all for joining us with another edition of the Locker Room Chat, highlighting the life, times, and sportscasting career of Ed Bowman.
Thank you very much.